So let me open by saying how wonderful it is to be back with you all after being in Louisville at the 81st General Convention of the Episcopal Church. I mean, it was fun, but I definitely missed you all. And it was a pretty amazing experience, and I'm looking forward to talking to you all about it after church during coffee hour. And I have swag and goodies if anyone wants some merch. So don't let me forget to pull that out. It's mostly stickers, but it's fun stuff. And we have all sorts of liturgical goodies that the General Convention have given us. New liturgy, new language, stuff like that we'll get to experience as the summer proceeds. But I'm very aware, after I look back over these last couple of weeks, the church does not live in a bubble. And I have to admit, a lot has happened in the past few weeks. So there's more here to acknowledge today than just all that fun news of the General Convention and, that we've newly elected the youngest presiding bishop ever in the Episcopal Church and all that hopeful new direction that are now open to us as the Episcopal Church. Because there's also hard things going on around us. There's stuff like heat, fires, wars, courts, and elections. Now, I'm not an expert on any of that, but I have to say, if you're anything like me, I've spent a lot of time reading the experts just to try to figure some of this out and get some answers. But today, I think I'm going to start with the gospel and just see where it takes us. So I think that this section of Mark should have the unofficial title, Jesus's Challenges. Because up to this point in Mark's narrative, Jesus was just on a roll. I mean, he had called disciples, he had proclaimed God's kingdom, calmed a storm. He's done a lot of healing and exorcising of unclean spirits, and he's even awakened a little girl from seeming death. Now, there's definitely critics. They show up in Mark's gospel extra early. But more or less all around the Sea of Galilee, it's been sell-out crowds for Jesus. And you can just imagine people starting to put together the tour t-shirts, right? But now Jesus meets the hometown crowds. And we all know that the hometown crowd can be the toughest audience of all. I mean, they are astounded, but not always in the good way. My commentary tells me that the Greek that is used in this passage implies that there's this powerful sense of disconnect. Disconnect between what one sees and what one knows to be true already, the assumptions that we bring into a situation. Everyone who's seen Jesus preach to them, they're having a hard time seeing the rabbi and the prophet and the healer filled with God's Spirit because they know this carpenter so well. Watched him grow up from being a little tiny toddler, right? I think that you would expect that kind of thing from brothers and sisters. But you're not always sure that you would get it from the whole hometown. And I think there's a lot of other family issues that could be going on here because it's possible that Joseph has died. And here's his brothers and sisters saying, wait a minute, you're the oldest son. How come you aren't staying home and running the carpentry business? Instead, you've just taken off and done this crazy itinerant preacher thing. I really like this part of the gospel. Jesus is so human here. I mean, all that stuff about leaving your family behind, you can see that it hits home for Jesus too. Well, the result is outrage, and everyone is getting upset and scandalized. And what happens? There's not as many healings, and Jesus can't do all the miracles that he's been doing everywhere else. So what is going on here? We're left asking the question, does Jesus' power really rely so much on us and our response to Jesus? So let's think about Jesus' job, because I think the answer to that question lies in a statement that he used to proclaim what his job was right at the beginning of his ministry. Here we hear him saying, prophets are not without honor except in their hometowns. And Jesus set himself up in the role of prophet from day one when he read from that scroll and said, I'm here to proclaim good news and release the captives and all of that. And honor was a big deal in Jesus' day. It was not just a thing like, do you honor this person? Do you respect them? Honor was, in fact, a whole system that connected families and individuals and whole communities into these relationships of mutual obligation. And every member of that system had a set part to play. So when we hear it said in the Gospels that honor is lacking, what it really means is that someone isn't playing their expected part in the system, and so things are out of balance. Now, in that kind of system, you can see how sickness, death, or anything that causes a person to take on a new or unusual role in the group becomes an issue of honor. Balance apparently is only restored when everyone either acknowledges the new position that the person holds in the community, their new role in the system, or they've gone back to normal, to the place where they came from. And people who aren't able to manage that, well, they're just kind of left out on the margins. So in this context, you can see why healing in Jesus' day isn't just about overcoming disease. That Jesus heals disease, but he also is there to transform all of that social rejection into social acceptance, being made whole as a community and reconciled. That puts Jesus' ministry into a whole new light, don't you think? Because it means that if Jesus is going to bring good news to the poor and proclaim that release to the captives and exorcise unclean spirits and heal the sick, then Jesus needs to get their communities on board too. It's not just a simple question of belief in the way that we think of faith healing today, but it's this whole reorienting of the way that people are being perceived in their families, in their towns, and in their wider communities that matters. I think that's why the relationship between the community and Jesus' ability to do deeds of power is highlighted in this gospel. Because if the community can't accept Jesus, the carpenter's son, as a prophet who does deeds of power and is an authorized bearer of God's words of power, then they will never be able to accept or literally restore to honor all of those in their midst who have been pushed out to its margins. People who've been pushed out through difference or sickness or misfortune. I think that's exactly why what we think of as radical welcome is at the center of Jesus' teaching and ministry and calling. Another word for it is just love, right? Love. Well, what about Jesus' response to what's going on? Because, of course, it's clear that Jesus is not surprised by his less than warm homecoming, and he certainly doesn't let it slow him down in his work of building God's kingdom. Jesus' response is to continue to transform people in relationship to their place in society, and he starts with his own circle of disciples. Jesus tips that teacher-student model on its head, and he gives his disciples the exact same job that he's doing. He hands over to them the same power to heal that he's been given from God, and says, you guys can go out and do it too. Call for the restoration of people alienated from their community. Model this love of God everywhere you go. Then he just sends them out to totally focus together on the building of all of these new relationships. Nothing to get in your way, no heavy weights and all of that. 2 by 2, transform the world one little place at a time. And he gives them buddies, which is helpful, and says just go where the Spirit calls you, where things are fruitful. But there's another great nugget here that I just want to highlight, which I don't want us to miss out. And that's that thing about brushing the dust off of your feet. Because in Jesus' day, welcome, that act of hospitality, was a critical part of society. And it was a huge obligation that you had to fulfill. They didn't have Motel 6s and campgrounds all over the place. So when you traveled, you needed to know that you would have a safe place to stay. And if you were at home, you needed to be able to welcome people and give them hospitality. So shaking off the dust was what people did. It was this very graphic and well-known form of insult to publicly declare that a particular host was failing to fulfill that very important obligation. It was, in fact, to question that host's honor. So do you see what Jesus is doing here? Instead of letting everyone call into question the honor of his ministry of healing and transformation, Jesus is calling into question the honor of folks who refuse to listen and to be transformed and to allow an opening up of who is welcome and made a part of their communities. And I think that's Jesus' challenge to us too. I think this gospel has a lot to say to us today about the life of our own world, our church, in the midst of all that, and all of our challenges and opportunities. It asks us very pointedly to think about all of the ways that our accepted social systems, not the same as Jesus's, but still systems that manage to marginalize people pretty much everywhere. And saying, think about how that plays out locally and globally, and the role and the calling that you have to disrupt and transform that to look more and more like the kingdom of God's love. So this is a challenge to us, to not just go with the flow, but to take a page from Jesus' playbook, set out in small teams, and have the goal of transformation of hearts and minds and communities in everything that we do. And it'll make a difference bit by bit if we are witnesses to the love of God in Jesus Christ. So, having just come from the General Convention, I have today asking also, what would Jesus' challenge be to the Episcopal Church today? In his sermon at the General Convention closing Eucharist, our new presiding bishop-elect, Sean Rowe, speculated on that very question. Bishop Rowe believes that as followers of Jesus and as Episcopalians, though we are not alone in this ministry, we have this unique understanding of reconciliation that comes to us from Jesus. And we need to find more and more ways as a church to help people of seemingly irreconcilable viewpoints in our world to find common ground and to build new relationships and to create solutions that meet some sort of sense of common good for everyone. The world's missing a lot of that right now, isn't it? So he says, go out there, build new relationships. Like, it's hard. We're small, right? The Episcopal Church, we're not the giant mega churches of the world. But he says that we're kind of like those tiny counter-cultural churches that Paul founded in all those port cities of the Roman Empire, who were out there courageously doing the work that they did too. Here's what he had to say. He says, the Episcopal Church, we are holding fast to our promises to uphold the full inclusion of LGBTQI+ persons as children of God. We're proclaiming and investing in our longing to become a beloved community, to question the racism that we've been a part of, and to help to transform that in the world too. We are committing to caring for God's creation and respecting the dignity of every human being. And, most importantly, we will not back down in our proclamation of the gospel just because other people understand it differently and are bigger, or think that they're more powerful or louder, or have a vision that denies the full humanity of every person. Now, Bishop Rowe reminded us that we also have our own stuff to reckon with. Like, there's work that we need to do inside our house too. We have transformation that needs to come. We need to continue to honestly face the things that divide us and dilute our witness to God's love. Things like how we love to intellectualize and study things instead of digging in and doing the difficult work on things like racial reconciliation or the transformation of our weighty and outdated church structures across the whole Episcopal Church. He said the number one challenge that we face as a church is, in fact, all that stuff that weighs us down. We need to do this important work so that we will have the capacity to keep on playing that loving, healing, and transforming role in our society and in our global community in this time of growing tension and polarization. I think Bishop Rowe was refreshing because he looks at us right in the eye. I mean, this is a huge worship service. People gathered from the entirety of the Episcopal Church, which encompasses all of the Americas. He says, we have got to get it together. And that's going to mean laying some things down, and the struggle will require tolerance for uncertainty and the ability to hold lightly to some of our beliefs about how things should be, so that we could listen to new voices. Sound familiar? I think just like in Jesus' time, healing for us today has a lot to do with the transforming of communal rejection into communal acceptance of everyone as a beloved child of God. Jesus laid it all out for us a long time ago. Travel together, travel light, build relationships of healing and transformation and love. Bishop Rowe comes, he's not the first person to talk about this stuff, and he closed his sermon by acknowledging the work of his predecessor, Bishop Michael Curry, who we know never stopped reminding us that love is what's at the heart of Jesus' challenge to us. So I think as I close today, I want to share with you Bishop Rowe's closing blessing to Bishop Michael Curry and to all of us. He said, "Let us go forth from here in the name of Christ, with thanksgiving for the witness and example of Michael Curry and the power of God working in him and in us. And may the love of Jesus Christ our Savior sustain us on this next